you are. You've showed up again tonight. And I've also kept my end of the bargain. 21 of you in 21 hours. Wow. I don't think Joe Rogan will be losing much sleep tonight. But sleep is what it's all about here. This is Mark Manning's Book at Bedtime. And if you have been following along, the first 2 chapters of... Oops, dropped my pen. Ideas Have Legs and Ripped Jackets. There you go. By Peter Howard. It's easy on the mind. I think it'll bring you down. What kind of day did you have? You can comment in the comments below. Oh yes, you can let me know. Who are you? Who are you, 1 or 2 listeners? What about my ding-a-ling? Yes, remember, if you buy me the a coffee on my PayPal, which is on the description below, I will make a big fuss out of you and ring my ding-a-ling for you. And name you, or name your initials, in case you're a private kind of person. So, we're on to chapter 3, boys and girls. I certainly hope you enjoy it. Let's get cracking here. It's a autumnal, wintry night. Well, that's a contradiction. It's an autumnal night in Dublin City. Kind of spitty, spotty rain. I kind of like that weather. Myself and my wife have just been out for a walk. Now, sit down there. I shall sit down, take the weight off my face. Or as they say in France, asseyez-vous. Let's get on with it. Chapter 3. Red Lenin and White Ties. That's T-I-E-S. Don't be getting any ideas. Hitler's idea was not the only big idea to burst upon mankind as a result of the 1914 to 1918 conflict. It was not the only big idea on the march as I and millions like me grew to manhood. For in 1917 the Germans discovered a secret weapon which, by a single explosion, put one of their most formidable enemies out of the war. The secret weapon was packed inside the domed head of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the world as Lenin. The decisive and disintegrating effect of his big idea upon the framework of a nation was so well understood and so greatly feared by the Germans that they sealed Lenin in a train on his passage through their country from Switzerland and smuggled him into Russia. He created a revolution there which changed forever the shape of that land. Lenin's idea is one of the most powerful of the new ideas which are on the march today. It has gained spectacular success. Out of that sealed train in 1917 stepped a man whose concentration passion towards... Out of that sealed train in 1917 stepped a man whose concentrated passion towards a single objective has penetrated to a greater or less extent within the structure of every nation in the world, working like yeast to agitate and stir and unsettle the existing order. When Lenin was 17 years old, they hanged his brother for attempting to kill the Tsar. Lenin began to hate. This fanatical genius of the hard, brilliant mind and the ruthless spirit smouldered with loathing against the power and wealth of the Tsar, which had destroyed his brother. He decided to replace the rule of one class by the rule of another class. He looked around and saw the hatred of the masses against the Tsar, so bitter that when the Tsar took a railway journey, paid soldiers had to be posted along the track to guard against accidents. He saw luxury and delicate social graces in the midst of starvation, corruption, and cruelty. He saw high society urging Christian morality upon the masses and accepting low farmyard morals for itself. and with a dynamic energy and ability which has seldom been equalled in human history, which has rattled the walls of the world and may yet pull nations down, he set himself to the task of creating chaos, so that his idea of a new world order might arise from it. He knew it was a tremendous task, but he was a tremendous human force. He said, "The dictatorship of the proletariat is a relentless struggle waged with bloodshed, a war 100 times more difficult, more long drawn out, more complicated than the most bloodthirsty war which could be possible between two nations." Lenin is embalmed. You can still see that quarter-noon moustache, that calculating colossal forehead, and that rocky jaw preserved by chemicals in Moscow against the attack of decay. In his living memorial is the momentum of his idea in the world he has quit, rather than in the cold and mummified lineaments preserved by those who, as a result of his passion, knew no other god to worship. Lenin's idea had its attraction for me, as I suppose it had to a greater or less extent for millions in that interwar period. Often I felt bitter and spoke bitterly about the miseries of the poor in my own country, one of the richest in the world, at a time when the unemployment figures in Great Britain were near the 3 million mark. I travelled the mining villages where for generations brave men had sweated in darkness and danger to keep the fires and furnaces of this nation aflame. In one street I saw 20 or 30 children playing. I stopped to watch them, and in a moment, anger, pity, humiliation, a compound of every deep feeling of the human heart, rose within me. For I saw that almost every one of those children had misshapen legs or ankles. They had felt the weakening drag of malnutrition, because there was so little money coming into the mining areas at that time. When I asked a member of Parliament about this tragedy, he said, "Well, it's very sad, but if they spend the dole on milk for the children instead of beer for themselves, they'd be better off." Perhaps there was some truth in the remark. I cannot say, but it sounded so cynical and it was so inadequate. It filled me with fury. I cursed God and man, especially that man. It was this feeling of disillusionment which springs up in the individual human heart at the bad moments when faith and hope are beyond the horizon, and which Lenin encouraged and integrated into a worldwide revolutionary movement. If the metallic Russian had been with me then, I should have been happy to string that MP up to a Whitehall lamppost. Yet, somewhere deep in my spirit, the nagging, reluctant question stirred. Human poverty and misery are vile, but does that make it right to hang or shoot people merely because they happen to be rich? I believed in justice, and by justice I did not mean merely justice for those I liked against those I did not like. I meant the old democratic conception of justice. Justice for all. Somehow, I could not believe in a justice which decreed terrorism against a particular race or class, however much from time to time I might have liked to see it operate. Lenin, in drafting the Soviet Penal Code, declared, "The legal trial is not intended to replace terrorism, but to base terrorism firmly on a fundamental principle." I did not want justice in the shape of terrorism, based firmly on a fundamental principle. I thought terrorism was wrong. But was my own answer right? I answered the challenge of slums, poverty, unemployment, with a fine, passionate, liberal spirit which I thought very noble, which hurt nobody, least of all myself, and which I hoped in time would make things better. My own remedy for the state of affairs was twofold. First, I, with violence and sincerity, attacked and blamed the men in charge of the state for their bungling and indifference. Second, I made up my mind that I would get into Parliament myself one day, and by winning power for myself, put right the things of the nation. I had better chances than most for exercising these qualities of criticism coupled with personal ambition, which were the best contribution so many of us were able to make to the interwar world. For I worked in Fleet Street. I was able to get out my views on millions of breakfast tables, day after day, week after week. For 7 long years I gave Fleet Street my life. In return, Fleet Street gave me 3 Fs: fun, fame, and fortune. It was a more ample return than is received from most things to which men devote their lives. At 9 o'clock each night, those massive steel and concrete structures in Fleet Street begin to quake and tremble like corn before the evening breeze. The very pinnacle of the roof shakes and oscillates at the moment when, embedded 50 feet below the surface of the earth, the sprawled machines begin to revolve and pour forth million upon million of newspapers to every corner of Britain until the daylight comes again. Life in Fleet Street is a bug. It burrows beneath your skin and into your bloodstream. There is a loyalty and gaiety of comradeship, and a zest and stir among the black brotherhood of ink. Life tastes strong and distinctive in the street. Its flavours there are full and grip the throat. You are of the world and in the world and yet above the world. You scan life from a crow's nest. The waves and tides of humanity surge and struggle and break around you. You perceive the toil and triumph, the suffering and success, the tears and the tumult, the complaints and the applause. You groan and rejoice in sympathy, for every good reporter must feel in his own heart, and so understand the emotions and the motives he describes. Yet all the time you remain a spectator and an observer, and some can still be found in Fleet Street. Not enough, but a valiant section, which hold their pens unimpassioned and without bias, servants only of the truth and masters of humanity. With it all, life in the street can be a jungle business, the survival of the foremost and death to the hindmost. The dives and joints which surround Fleet Street are awash with those who, for one reason or another, have not stood their feet and have been carried off by the tide. Journalists seldom retire, though all declare they long for the day when they will do so. Some rise to the top of their Some rise to the top of their profession. Some take to drink, or get fired, or go into politics. But they stick to the black craft. There is a sense of power in the knowledge that the words you write late at night will affect the thinking of millions of homes on the morning after. Many journalists whose names you would not recognize consider that they exercise a greater influence on public events than some well-known politicians who make speeches at by-election after by-election. The journalists are right. How much can the fate of nations be affected by small things? More than once I have seen leader columns, potent and splenetic, which have created confusion in the ministerial minds and have rocked cabinets. And in my heart I have laughed, knowing that the spleen in the leader column, the real sting of it was due to the fact that the writer just had a row with his lady-love or had drunk too much at luncheon and made an ass of himself. I took a degree at Fleet Street University. I learned how the wheels go round. Not the big wheels, you see, but the little ones inside the machine of life which produce traction. I learned of the oil which smooths the water and of the grease which eases the pathway to success. And that oil and grease, which were so indispensable, a part of the interwar world, became very much a part of my own living. As I learned the technique of back-scratching and man-pleasing, which are needed for self-advancement, my fine ideals became less noticeable. Sometimes, as I worked in Fleet Street, hungry for my articles to be praised and recognized, sore if they were abused or neglected, I remembered my childhood Sunday afternoons. I spent them in church, a regular and enforced visitation. There was a children's service. From the pulpit the preacher asked questions which the children had to answer. "Who killed the giant Goliath?" he would ask. Half the children were scared to answer to that white surpliced figure which towered above them. Half the children did not know the answer. I belonged to both halves. But the stern and beboned elbow of my adult escort would dig me a dig. "David," the voice would whisper in my ear. Then another dig. "Go on, say David." And obediently I would gulp and mutter, "David," from our pew. "Very good, very good," the preacher would remark from the heights above, and a smile like sunrise would dawn above the surplice, while my escort would proudly look around, taking to herself the admiration of her charge. Of course, I quickly lost my sense of fright at answering the preacher, for I loved the glory of praise and a warm feeling of being the centre of admiring glances. Young as I was, I hungered for it. As soon as the preacher asked his questions, I would eagerly listen for the prompting whisper from my right, and bawl out the answer swiftly, lest anyone should beat me. I was in such a hurry to reply that one day I shouted, "Abraham," when the answer should have been Ahab. 25 years later, I was in the full flush of triumph as a political writer, battering at the ramparts of achievement and storming them one by one. Yet I often remember that Brighton church. Then I was invited to a city dinner, to make a speech in reply to the toast of the guests. I had never been to a city dinner. I accepted. A few days before the dinner I was sent the list of guests for whom I was to reply. It contained the names of some of the most successful in the land, men in whose hands the destiny of this country's government and business rested in those interwar years. You would know those names if I set them down on paper for you. My emotions on receiving this list were twofold. I was excited at the opportunity, but fearful of failure. At that time, I was working in close contact with Lord Beaverbrook. Most days, I spent hours in his company. Lord Beaverbrook is a man whose knowledge is clear and deep. He is a scholar of humanity. His special subject is human weakness. He knows it sideways, backwards, and end to end. I told him of the situation I found myself. I asked what I should say in my speech. He sat, a small figure, in a huge chair. A great grin then creased his countenance. He said, "Peter, pour the soft oil of flattery down their backs. You will find men cannot have too much of it, however much they protest they do not like it." I wrote out a speech, including a friendly reference to each guest of distinction. It seemed high-pitched in its terms of adulation. I read it to Lord Beaverbrook. He did not approve. His criticism was based on the fact that my references were not oily enough. I redecorated my phrases in accordance with Lord Beaverbrook's suggestions. When the moment came at the city banquet, I arose. I poured out my praises with such appearance of sincerity as I could muster. My white tie and tailcoat helped to give tone to the occasion. As I sat down, the thought crossed my mind, it's too much. Nobody could swallow that dose. The applause was a cannonade. I was undoubtedly the success of the evening. One distinguished guest shook my hand and said, "If I may say so, Howard, you are a very remarkable young man." Pour the soft oil of flattery down their backs. Men cannot have too much of it. Lord Beaverbrook was right. I knew it myself. I found my heart pounding with pleasure at the compliment which had been paid me. As I drove home in the taxi that night, suddenly upon my cinema screen mind flashed a moving picture of a small boy in Brighton Church all those years ago, with an Eton collar sawing his neck, tensely waiting the whisper from his escort, shouting the answer and looking round to catch the applause. A week or two later, I received an invitation to wear the livery of the city company whose guest I had been, and also to become a free man of the City of London. So I went up in the world. I was quick to learn the lessons of life, and saw the way to get on. Once I wrote of a left-wing politician. He came to London with the fires of revolution burning in his belly, but they were quenched by other men's champagne. This, literally and figuratively, became true of myself as I went up in the world. The good things of life, as they came my way, blunted my resentment about the bad things of life which came the way of others. Success became an end in itself, instead of a means of righting the wrongs of the world. I was a part of that complacent, man-pleasing age which spent so much time telling itself the things it wanted to hear instead of the things it ought to hear. Part of an age when politicians withheld facts about the world situation in case it cut their party popularity. Part of an age where newspapers poured out prosperity stories up to the very eve of the greatest explosion in human history, knowing those stories keep folk happy and are food for advertising revenue. And so endeth Chapter 3 of Ideas of Legs by Peter Howard. It's waiting. How about you? How's everything? I hope it's well in your life. And if not, don't you worry. Someone's given you grief, don't you worry. Someone, the Lord above, will put a stop to their gallop. And if you have family and friends, cherish them and love them. But now I'm sounding preachy, so I shall leave you and say, see you tomorrow night. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. Mwah. Good night from Ireland.